I know we have some fans of jazz in the room. Jazz music, is that not true? Yes. We have lots of jazz lovers from the 210 group in the morning, and I know a lot of us also love jazz. I grew up in a very musical household. We had lots of music practice going on in my house. My dad did a lot of choral music. He sang a lot of choral music. He sang a lot of opera. And so there was lots of music practice going on in our house. I played clarinet, so there was a lot of music practice for that, and piano. My sister played violin, so there was a lot of that music practice going on. My mom sang in the church choir, and I did later on, so there was a lot of practice for that. So, I mean, there was music all the time. We grew up in Sacramento, which is home, until a couple of years ago, to the Dixieland Jazz Jubilee. And if you've ever been to the Dixieland Jazz, anybody ever been up to that? Okay, it's like a convention of jazz lovers from all over the country and the world. It was enormous. 100,000 people would come in its height, and they would descend on downtown Sacramento, and they would listen to jazz for like a long weekend. So there would be jazz bands all over the place, and people would just pop in and out of these tents and listen to these different styles and groups of jazz. My cousin actually came out from Colorado one year and played in a group, and so we went to see him, and so lots of jazz music. There are a couple things that make jazz jazz. One is the scales that they use. You know, it's not major scales. It tends to be some different minor scales, and that just helps with the tone and the feel of jazz being a little bit different. There's also that thing that jazz talks about called like a groove. That when you get in the groove, it's just, the music flows and you feel it, and there's this connection that people have with it, and it just works. It's such a great rhythm and a groove. One of the other things that makes jazz is improvisation. That's always the fun part. You know, when some musician comes up in the middle of the song and they solo, and they just play according to the key and the rhythm and the groove of the song, and they just make it up on the spot. And it's so fun. It doesn't matter what instrument. There's drums that do improv, and there's saxes and clarinets and bass, whatever does an improv. But the improv makes the songs. So often it's, the melody of the song is sort of what gives the song its feel, but what makes a song famous is often the improv. So when jazz was really becoming popular, like in the 50s or so, musicians, as they were improvising, as they were developing all this music, they developed a whole set of language to describe the things they were doing. I mean, there's vocabulary out there that jazz musicians came up with for all kinds of different things, and they would just have their own talk. Whenever somebody was doing something that people thought was just super cool, was just different, and they're surprised by it, they developed a phrase for it. So when there was a musician who was doing something or improvising, and they would say, and they're just sitting basking in it and marveling at it, they said, "That's far out." And it caught on, and that's how far out became such an iconic term. I wonder, would we call God far out? I mean, we call God lots of different things. We call God mighty, and we call God loving, we call God powerful, we call God compassionate, we call God wise and eternal, and all these different things. But would we call God far out? Do we ask God to do big, amazing things sometimes? Yeah. Far out things. I mean, do we need God to do things that are beyond our control and our ability and our strength? Yeah, I mean, things that we would call, those are far out. Does God sometimes surprise us, doing things that after the fact we think, how did that happen? Oh, that's far out. I mean, there's so many ways in which we could describe that God is far out. Joseph, the family of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all of his kids, Joseph was very good to his family. If you remember anything about the story of Joseph, Joseph was not treated well at first. He was chided by his brothers. He was teased by his brothers. He was thrown in a pit by his brothers. He was sold by his brothers. He was not treated well by his brothers. But in the end, Joseph was very kind to his brothers. All of those other brothers who were suffering, all that family who was suffering from the famine and the plague that was going on in their land, while Joseph had risen to power down in Egypt, he was kind to his brothers who came looking for food, who came looking for sustenance, who came looking for safety and relief from their famine. Throughout the story of Joseph and his brothers, Joseph extended extreme kindness to them. And eventually, Joseph provided even land for his brothers and his family to come and live in. It was that land in Egypt, that land that was called Goshen. It was that land that sustained their flocks and allowed them to farm and gave them a new life, when back home there was still a famine. So all of Joseph's family came down and they settled. The end of the book of Genesis, the beginning of Exodus, is the story of all of these people coming down and settling in this land that Joseph allowed them to live in. And they were doing just fine. They were not in a hurry to get back to Canaan because things were going okay, although they knew that this was temporary. Toward the end of the book of Exodus, it says this about their temporary nature. It says, God will surely come back to help you and lead you out of this land of Egypt. He will bring you back to the land he solemnly promised to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So they knew someday they were going to make that trip back. But for now, things were okay in Egypt. They were safe from the famine. They had water for their livestock. They had farming. I mean, it was all fine. Years later, though, the king of Egypt, who eventually became the Pharaoh of Egypt, that we learn he's called, that Pharaoh, that king of Egypt, no longer remembered the good things that Joseph had done for the land of Egypt and for others. And so that king of Egypt became very concerned and scared with the success of Joseph and his family. Because Joseph and his family, they were thriving. Their livestock was growing, their farms were spreading, their people were growing in number, so much so that it posed a threat to the Egyptian people. So the king he's on guard. He's worried about the fact that these people are becoming numerous, and he's concerned. So that's when the king enslaves all of the Hebrew people, and he requires work of them, manual labor and all kinds of work. He thinks that is going to stifle these people. Does it stifle them? The answer is no. They continue to grow. They continue to thrive. And so the king says, I'm going to work them even harder. So he extends their hours and extends their projects, and the enslavement becomes harsher. But still the people grow. Still the Hebrew people continue to thrive. Eventually, the Pharaoh says, this will not do. I am threatened by this. They cannot be more numerous and stronger than we are as Egyptian people, so I am going to force their families to not continue to grow. So he creates a scheme whereby baby boys will not be allowed to grow up and live. And it's a horrible scheme, and he puts people in leadership of it. Does it work? No, it doesn't work again. I mean, it continues to not work. And the king is getting frustrated, clearly, and he extends one more, even more severe way of stifling the Hebrew families. And it's that horrible curse that he brings on the Hebrew people, and he says that any Hebrew boy who is born will be thrown into the Nile River. I mean, it's terrible. This is how bad and how frustrated he is, how bad things have gotten, and how threatened this king is. This is the book of Exodus. This is the beginning of the story of Exodus. Exodus is the second book in the Bible. It's the seventh longest book in the Bible, and it's the most repeated story in all of the Bible. Because the story of Exodus is every one of our stories. I love what there's a pastor in London somewhere, and he says this about the book of Exodus. The whole story of the Christian life is effectively an Exodus story in a different key. Everything that continues to happen in our lives is an Exodus story. And as we look through this book for the next while, we're going to see pieces of the story, but also the big story. And let me tell you, this story is our story over and over again. And the fact that Exodus establishes this story as so fundamental to who we are and also presents and establishes characteristics of God, about who God is and how God works in our lives, this is a story to grab onto. This is a story for us to say, oh, now I understand better how God works in my life. So we're going to walk through some of the Exodus story. We begin with it today, picking up where Joseph left off with his family. Things had been good, and then they got worse, and now they're dangerous. And this is where we pick up the story in Exodus chapter 2. Now, a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him up out of the water." The Exodus story started out of this whole situation that we just described, of Pharaoh being threatened and Pharaoh being concerned and Pharaoh being scared and bringing these curses on the Hebrew people and their families and their population. And all of a sudden, from the first line, we get this reversal, this turn. It's like all of a sudden the story turns from all the Pharaoh in Egypt and his threat to something different is happening. Something different is going on. And in this story, there are no less than 7 reversals that happen to signal something is changing. This is not how it has to go. God is up to something. We get the first one right at the beginning in the first line. This whole idea of all of a sudden to Levite parents, a baby is born. Now, I mean, to us, we're like, hey, cool, Levite, sounds interesting. To them, this is like hugely important. Because the Levite people were the tribe of people that God had blessed to be the priests, the ones who were in charge of administering the relationships with God that the people had. They were the go-betweens. They were the people who, if anybody helped you have a relationship with God, it was the Levite people. So these Levites who were commissioned and called and set apart for this task, they were super important and prized in the group of God's people. So for a Levite dad and a Levite mom to be married, it's like they're a power couple. You know, they're strong and they're both from the right families and they're both bringing all the goods to the relationship. And then they have a baby. They have a baby boy who's a Levite child. So everybody's thinking, okay, big role, big responsibility. You're a Levite through and through. This is going to be an important child. But at the same time, it's a baby boy. So there's this tension going on of, oh, we're so excited that this is a Levite child, but at the same time, we know what's happening in the land of Egypt. There's a turn going on here from the power that Egypt is bringing to the beginning of a hope that God might be bringing. Maybe the power in Egypt may not last forever. Maybe there's a hint that something else might come. So when this baby's born, mom says, this baby's special. There's something about this baby. So she hides the baby. And when she can't conceal the baby anymore, for whatever reason, we don't know, the baby's old enough, the baby's too loud, the baby takes over the area, the baby's too visible, who knows what the issue is. But the baby cannot be concealed any longer. So she has a decision to make. She has to do something with the baby boy, knowing full well the situation in Egypt and what happens to baby boys. Reversal number 2 is the river. Because what did Pharaoh say about the river? The river is the place where all baby boys who are born will be thrown. And everybody knew what the Nile River was all about. Crocodiles, poisonous snakes, and bacteria. It was not a river to swim in. People did not go and vacation in the Nile. They knew exactly what the Nile was like. But mom has a decision to make. And her decision is, do I want Egypt to handle my son, or do I want to handle my son? And so she takes it upon herself to handle her son. And the river that is supposed to be a curse on all these baby boys becomes the salvation for this baby boy. Complete reversal of what it was supposed to be and what it had been for so many others. God can do far out things. And it's not just that the baby survived, this baby was rescued. I mean, it's not just that mom put him in a basket and the boy sailed down the river and he survived. No, this baby was plucked out of the river and rescued. And so many more things happened to the baby. So not only did the baby live, the baby thrived. Complete reversal of what should have happened. And who rescued the baby? This is the next crazy reversal. It makes sense that a Hebrew person would have rescued a Hebrew baby. You know, they're part of the same people. It's like, oh, I'm going to rescue my people. I'm going to look out for my own people. But it was an Egyptian who rescued the Hebrew baby. I mean, the Egyptians were supposed to stifle the Hebrews, not rescue them and save them. But it was an Egyptian princess whose dad made the curse. I mean, there's just layers and layers of how could this be? And it is, because God's just reversing over and over these situations. The baby needs to be cared for. The baby needs to be nursed. The baby needs to be fed. And I love when the sister says, should I go get one of the Hebrew women? And the Pharaoh's daughter is like, yeah, go, sure. They were aware of the Hebrew midwives. The Egyptians had, if you read back in Exodus 1, the Hebrews were very aware of the Hebrew midwives. And so they knew that there were lots available. They had communication with them, and that made sense to them. Of course, go get one to nurse your child. So the daughter goes, and who does she get? She gets mom. I mean, this is crazy. The mom set the baby to sail, to survive. The baby not only survives, but gets rescued, and then mom gets to care for the child. I mean, it's just nuts how this can happen. Mom is now caring for her own child. Not only that, but Pharaoh's daughter says, I'd love for you to care for this baby, and I'm going to pay you to do it. I mean, they're like pilfering off of the Egyptians. They are gaining from the Egyptians because God is just reversing this whole process again and again. So finally it comes time for the baby to be given back to Pharaoh's daughter. The baby is old enough, probably weaned, probably whatever age it is, and the baby needs to be given, the toddler needs to be given back to the princess. Not only does the princess just take the child, the princess adopts the child as her own. I mean, she just takes the child in. She gives the child a whole new life. She gives the child something the child would have never had otherwise, and provided for the child in a brand new way. How many times can God do something over and over again that to us we would say, this is far out, this is nuts, this is not what should normally happen? 7 times at least in this story, God reverses things. Because Exodus is establishing something about God's character, that God has the habit, the ability to reverse what goes on in our lives and in the world. When we need it to happen, when we're desperate for it to happen, when we know of no other way, God has the ability to reverse what can happen. Now that was 7 reversals, but there's then the double reversal that happens. Mom takes the baby, when she's concerned about the baby, she puts him in the basket and sets him to sail on the river. Now, Mom could have put him in any kind of basket. The Hebrew people had lots of different types of baskets. They were in, the culture they were in. They wove baskets, they made baskets, and they had a word for every different kind of basket that was out there. If she wanted to put him in a bread basket, it would have said he was put in a bread basket that was made for bread. If she wanted to put him in a harvesting basket, one of their big harvesting baskets, there was a word for a harvesting basket. She could have put him in that basket. There was a two-handled basket they had, and they had a word for a two-handled basket. She could have put him in a two-handled basket and called it a two-handled basket, but she didn't. She put him in this vessel that actually doesn't show up anywhere in the Bible as a basket. We know it's called a basket because of other literature that's out there that uses this word, but in the Bible, it's not a basket. It shows up in one other place. Another place where there's a vessel on the water that saves people. Moses has set sail actually in an ark, just like Noah climbed into an ark. And think about it. Moses was set sail on the water and survived in an ark. Noah set people and animals sail on the water and survived. Moses ushered in a new life for his people, just like Noah ushered in a new life for his people. This ark was the iconic saving tool that God used both for Noah and for Moses. God uses this reversal of being able to sustain us when things just don't make sense, and establishing a trend of what God is able to do. God is able to take a situation, and God is able to preserve us and save us and rescue us and put us on a new path, ushering in a new life for us. Watch these icons, watch these stories, watch these truths about God throughout God's Word. What is God doing through all this? Why does God do things like this and trace these stories? It's because God is establishing who God is and a way for us to understand and be able to trust in who God is throughout our own lives. Here's one way to say it. Here's one way of describing how this works and the summary of this. God goes far out to provide for us a way out and back into a relationship with God. God does crazy things to provide a way out of our problems and our situations and our confusion and the decisions we don't know how to make, and bring us back to a relationship with God, the restoration, saving work of Jesus. When we ever have a few extra minutes between one activity and another, or one place to be in another, we love games. We have a lot of different games. Some are short-term games and some are longer games, but whenever we have a few minutes, one of our short go-to games is the game of Uno. Anybody like Uno? Yeah. All right, a couple. It's an older game, but it's a good game. It's a great one to play when you just have a few minutes. One of my favorite, I like the traditional version of Uno. There are lots of these others. They've come out with Uno Flip, and they've come out with Dos, and they've come out with these other versions of Uno. But I love that throughout all the different versions, they've kept a lot of the same cards. My favorite card, can you guess what it is? Reverse. Yeah, it's the reverse card. I love the reverse card because, here's why though. I love the reverse card because you get in a groove of playing. Somebody plays a yellow 6, and somebody plays a yellow 9, and then somebody plays a yellow skip, and then somebody plays a red skip, and then somebody plays a red draw too. You're just in this rhythm going around, and then somebody slips a reverse in. And what happens? Everybody's like, oh, okay, who goes next? Oh, wait, it's your turn. No, now it's your turn. And you gotta reset. And you gotta change your rhythm because everything's all messed up. God reverses things and he just messes up how things are going. This is a good thing because, like we said, God goes far out to provide for us a way out to bring us back to a relationship with God. We're going to look at the story of Exodus, the book of Exodus, for the next couple months. It's a long book, but it's a good book. We're going to look at it in two different ways. One way is we're going to just sort of skip through it on Sundays. We're going to kind of skip and then land on a story throughout Exodus, especially the stories that have a lot of personal interaction and things that people do. So we're going to look at some of those stories. If you want to read along and read the whole story and really walk through it, the bookmark in your bulletin goes through the whole book of Exodus. And once a week, it adds in a place in the Bible where the Exodus story shows up. So a lot of them are in Psalms and other places, but once a week we get to see, oh, that's where the story lands in another spot in the Bible. So walk along, skip along, we're going to work through the book of Exodus. And I trust, I hope through it, that we see this continuing work that God does, that God does these crazy things because God is concerned about us, the way we live, and to bring us back to a relationship with God. So let's pray.